Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, hosted by me, Suzifeay. I'm inviting some people, some old favourites, back into the book bag to find out what they've been up to since I spoke to them last, talk about their writing life and their inspirations and just generally what being a writer is all about at the moment. So one of my great favourites, I'm inviting him into the book bag now, is my old friend DJ Taylor. Yes, here he is.
Sorry. I'm here. Here I am.
We've had a few little technical issues getting this together. So I'm here, you're here, David. Welcome back into the crazy world of the book bag.
It's great to be back in the fulcrum of organized chaos, if there can be such a thing, as your book bag. And I was shocked to discover when I revisited our first conversation that it was 2 years ago. It cannot be that long ago. But it's great to be back. I know.
We were talking about, if you remember, this lovely book, your short stories, Stooky Blues, and you had also had this book of collected criticism out. And I think you were just gearing up for the publication of Orwell, The New Life, your revisited.
Yeah, it was published in May 2023. You're right. So there was a lot. And I'd also got a novel coming out in the autumn called, 2023 was a very busy year, actually, quite unprecedented in its urgency, I suppose. But here we are 2 years later with a whole new fresh set of projects and
well, you're one of the busiest people in the literary world, and your oeuvre, your output is pretty staggering. We talked about the criticism, the short stories, many novels. The last two novels that, you did the music novels, didn't you?
The music biz ones, yes.
Yeah, which were great fun. Rock and Roll is Life, followed by Flame Music. Is there going to be, a kind of punk version, or are we moving on with that story?
It's interesting, actually. I enjoyed writing those two novels probably more than anything I've done in decades, because they wrote themselves. I had a whale of a time. It enabled me to use all sorts of obscure and information that I'd picked up over the years, reading music magazines and album sleeves when I should have been doing something more useful. But in some ways, writing about popular music, it's the same as writing about sport, especially about football, in that you fall into a black hole between two different kinds of audiences. You have the music audience and you have the literary audience, and the literary audience is interested but slightly condescending and thinking, it's just dreadful people in leather jackets playing guitars. And the music audience thinks, it's a bit clever, I'm not really sure about this, and all these pastiche album reviews and so forth. And I greatly enjoyed doing them, but I'd be the first person to say they didn't particularly work commercially. And, it was a case of it was near run things. I mean, a studio bought a TV option for Rock and Roll is Life, but it just didn't quite and one expects this because, as I say, it goes with the territory, I think, about writing about popular music. And if you write books about novels about popular music, I do find there is this terrible air of suspicion immediately hangs over the proceedings. And I suppose if it came to it, in my protagonist, Nick, the raisonneur of the two novels, is born in 1942. So by the time of the second one, by the time of Flame Music, he's in his late 30s, early 40s. And of course, enthusiast though he is, he's getting steadily more out of touch with the kids and where it's at and all these other happening phrases. But I think if it came to it, there could probably be one more, but he would have to slightly change the direction of his career again, because in the first novel he's the publicist, in the second novel he's running a record label. I think in the third time round he'd probably have to be managing he'd have to be managing a band, because he couldn't be doing the same things again. So I've got, and also there's the question of my knowledge of the milieu, which is absolutely, with no false modesty, unprecedented for the 70s and early 80s. And then it gets a bit thin as the 1980s goes on. But I do know a bit. I was very interested in Britpop. I was very interested in the music scene in the mid 1990s, despite the pressures of, family life and children and so forth. And I could probably summon up enough vestigial knowledge of the mid 90s to write a Britpop novel. But I just don't think that enough people are going to be interested in this, which is a shame. Because it's something I very much enjoyed doing, and again, as with so often with literature, the people who liked it really liked it, and the people who didn't like it stood by with puzzled brows. But anyway, that's where we are. It would be nice to write a third one, Rock and Roll is Life Part 3, but something deep within me suspects that it won't happen.
I think Nick should manage a Manchester band that is a kind of following in Oasis's.
Yeah. Well, actually, my idea, the only idea I've got, insofar as I have one, is he should manage a kind of absurdist version of the Spice Girls. That's the only plan that I have. He should start off. You see, the only idea I have is that he should start off trying to manage a Britpop group. In about 93, 94, but just finding them so awful and precious and difficult to deal with that he thinks, I've had enough of this. I want something where they're more malleable and I can sort of imprint my. I suppose it would be like, Richard E. Grant managing the Spice Girls in the Spice Girls movie, that sort of thing, I think. But again, this is merely a suggestion. I don't suppose, given the current state of the publishing wars, that it will ever come to fruition. But that's where we are on the music project.
So in terms of your writing life, do you have these sort of various pots are boiling here and there? Well, I could do this, I could do that, and then there's that idea,
Yes. I mean, there's always a list of projects, some of which are cut and dried and are happening, and some of which are potential, and some of which are simply, fond gleams in a far off eye. So, I mean, at the moment, I've got another book of short stories coming out in the summer called Poppyland, which is it's more of the Norfolk stuff, but there is some additional extra Norfolk material, so it's not Sticky Blues Part 2. I'm hoping that it's sort of moving on from that, and I'm just getting ready to start writing a book about Tolkien, which is due at the end of next year. Not a conventional biography, which I think would in any case probably be prescribed by the estate, which is quite a vigilant body, the Tolkien estate, but it's one of those kind of oblique glancing modern books about writers, simply looking at Tolkien in the way that one would look at George Orwell and Evelyn Waugh. What was his motivation? What were his personal myths when he writes? How does he write? And what sort of tricks is he trying to play on the and Tolkien? I mean, I've read a lot of Tolkien scholarship in the last year or so, and it's not like that. That's not the kind of thing that but it's not going to be a book for Tolkien buffs. It's going to be a book for people who read and enjoyed The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and wonder what else is sort of going on there beneath the surfaces. So it's not an addition to the huge corpus of Tolkien criticism published by American university presses. And usually I've discovered written by lecturers at Bible colleges in the Midwest. They tend to be the Tolkien aficionados in a really big way. So it's not that kind of book. It's much more of a kind of, let's look at Tolkien in the way you would look at any great sort of modern contemporary writer and see what makes him tick. So I'm just getting ready to write that. And meanwhile, there are all kinds of other things bubbling away, which would probably be a bit premature to start divulging. But yes, there's the usual list of projects is bubbling away on the back burner. It's the only thing. It's the only thing that keeps me sane. I mean, if I didn't have the idea of I think we talked about this last time, but I've always I never particularly cared for the writings of Hugh Walpole. But one thing I did admire about it was that every Christmas he would sit down in his house at Cat Bells in the Lake District, and he would write a huge list of what he intended to do in the next 10 years. And until he became ill, because he died in his late 50s, he was a diabetic, he didn't look after himself particularly, but his work rate was prodigious. And certainly through the 1930s, what he wrote down that he intended to do, he more or less did. And I always thought that was extremely praiseworthy and creditable, to sort of have your ambitions and try and fulfill them. So I always like to have a huge list of things I would like to do fairly soon, and see if I can. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work. Sometimes you get some very interesting project that's slightly left field, slightly out of the margin, beyond the margin of what one customarily does, and it kind of doesn't work out for various reasons. And you shrug your shoulders and you go on and you find something else. But I do like having all these plates spinning, because it in the most sort of fundamental way, it gives life an interest.
Yes, yeah, and just to mention about the music books, you did get to do a gig and perform. I mean, you did become the band that you were writing about. You were the troubled singer.
It was one of the most wonderful half hours of my life, Suzi. That was. I got a bass player and a drummer, and the bass player fortunately knew something about music, which I don't. And there were 3 songs which had been written for an EP that accompanied the Flame music book. And we did a couple of cover versions. And for 30 minutes, we entertained a select audience at the Book Hive, Norwich's, in fact, East Anglia's premier independent bookshop. And it was an absolutely wonderful time. And I was amazed at my chutzpah I've been able to do it, because not having done anything like that for about 40 years, if not more, it is very difficult to sing and play guitar at the same time. It really is. I'd forgotten how difficult it is. And what was quite gratifying was that I expected to know everybody in the audience, which, as I say, was select. And in fact, quite a few people came along who I didn't know. So they'd obviously come because they were interested, not just because they were mates who thought, let's go and sort of, clap politely at this dreadful. And it was enormous fun. And I'd like to do, I'm hoping it will happen again, because there are some more songs that have been demoed, and the bass player is keen, and I'm hoping that this will, the thing is that there isn't a book to promote about it as of yet. They're just songs, but I'm hoping we can find some way of jumping this hurdle, and there'll be some more music.
I'm sure you will. And I wished I could have been at that gig. I'm sure I was doing something else, and I'll be at the next one.
Yeah, of course you will. Yes, yeah.
That is a promise. Well, you've got these new short stories coming out. I thought I'd ask you about how that works. I mean, fitting them in among the larger projects. Do you sort of have a day of where you think, I've just got this great idea for a story, I'm going to put my big book on hold, I'm just going to write this story, or do you write them in the afternoon and do big book work in the morning?
It's much more industrial than that. Really. I mean, for example, Poppyland, which is coming out, which Salt are publishing in. Quick puff for Salt there, fine independent firm, great to be published by them. They're doing a wonderful job. And that's coming out in June. Now, how that came about was that at the end of last year, the end of 2023, I had a window of opportunity because I was sort of thinking about the Tolkien book, thinking about the next nonfiction thing, and there was a window of opportunity, and I just simply sat down and wrote them. I had all the ideas because it's Norfolk, so there's all. So I sat down.
So it wasn't just sort of one. I do one, and then I do something else for a month.
No. So I wrote. How many are there? 13 stories in 3 months, because the ideas were there. And as you know, a short story collection is not a particularly lengthy animal. I mean, this is about 55, 60,000 words, I think. And I found, it sounds Starkovian. It sounds like Anthony Trollope writing the finishing words of Barchester Towers at 4:31 a.m., having a cup of coffee, and then beginning on Dr. Thorne at 4:38. It's not like that, because you see, they because of the locale, because of 11 of the 13 stories are set in Norfolk, there's a certain amount of cross-fertilization, and you're getting immersed in the milieu. And so I would write the first story and think, which the first short story happens to be set in Cromer, on the coast here, 20 miles away. And as I was writing it, I'm thinking Cromer's near Sheringham, Sheringham's near North Walsham's up. And so all the time I'm writing the first story, the seeds of the second one are sowing, and then it goes on like that. And then when after I'd written about 10 or 11, I thought, let's, as the opportunity is there, let's fill out the volume with some stuff which is not set in Norfolk. So I wrote a couple of other ones where I'd had the idea idea lurking around for years, and this was just then an opportunity to do it. So it was pretty much a forced march, but that's how I liked doing it, I suppose. I think we talked about this last time, and a part of it is a reflection on the way in which the literary world has changed, because in the old days, if you published a collection of short stories, you would collect up what you had written in however many years since the previous collection, write a couple of long ones to fill out the volume, and there you were. But as you know, as we used to say many years ago, there is no real market for the short story anymore. BBC takes very few literary magazines print them. I know there's a big sort of online market, but I'm too old a dog for those sort of kind of new tricks. So I find that if you want to write a book of short stories, which I very much do, because I'm very interested in the form, and I like the constraints, and I like being told 3,000 words, or whatever sort of level you set. I mean, I used to love writing short stories for broadcast on BBC in the days when one could, because you knew it was 2,000 words. 13 minutes, and every sentence has to add up. It must be like doing a 3-minute pop single. There is no room for any kind of padding. It becomes an exercise in pure form, and that to me is interesting. I like those kind of constraints, and I like, in some ways, paradoxically, the lack of freedom is freedom. If you see what I mean. And so I like doing them, but if you do write short stories, you have to sort of, I think, appreciate the fact that they there's no market for them other than the finished volume.
Yes, they used to be, if you got a collection of short stories, it would say, Tea at the Vicarage was published in.
Yeah, that's it. I remember writing. I remember going through and sort of thinking, where did that come from? And then you think, XYZ was broadcast on Radio 4, published in the Literary Review, blankety blank. These days, they're all completely. So everything that appears in Poppyland, with the exception, I think, one story that's coming out in Norfolk magazine or something like that, they are all newly published. So there's again, in the old days, you would pick up William Trevor's latest collection of short stories and you'd think to yourself, I'm sure I read that in the New Statesman 3 years ago, and you probably had, because they all one of the advantages of that, of course, is you got paid twice, or sometimes even 3 times on the radio. That doesn't happen these days. As a kind of marketing decision, writing a collection of short stories is pure commercial suicide, but I like writing them. It's not a question of, obviously there's no money in it, hardly any, but I do like doing them.
Yeah, it's sad because it is a great form, and many things about the present day is people being short of time, and the boom in poetry is all about people, just wanting something.
The micro focus. So, God, yes, isn't literature being suborned to the micro focus these days? It's terrifying, isn't it? Does anyone read Dickens anymore? I don't know.
Oh, I don't know. I'm about to embark on Pickwick Papers.
Oh, good for you. Yeah.
I know it's the only one I haven't read, so I thought, well, that will be interesting. Having read absolutely all the novels, much of the journalism, much of the short stories, it'll be quite interesting to take a look at that and see what I think. So yes, and then this is the reviewer's kind of, not dilemma, but you read things because you've suddenly got a commission, so
of course you do.
So I shall be enjoying writing about that, because I think it is actually, if you read everything that's contemporary all the time, it's very good to sort of get a reset by reading somebody like Dickens, I find. Do you still find time to sort of go back to a classic, or maybe there aren't?
No, I mean, I think during one of the lockdowns, I set myself the George Gissing challenge, which was to read all of his novels again, and I more or less succeeded. I just think there are a couple of the early ones, some very lengthy early ones that I missed. There was a bit of a Thomas Hardy challenge. I'm always rereading bits of Thackeray. I'm always rereading. I'm a great fan of early 20th century American naturalist novels, people like Dreiser and James T. Farrell and Upton Sinclair. And I'm always just kind of rereading those to, having another look, just to sort of pick up resonances or trying to get commissions. It's amazing. I find these days that in some ways American periodicals are much more interested in abstruse stuff than English ones. So I'm always getting American magazines saying, can you do something? And I'll say, oh, it's 100 years since Dreiser's American Tragedy. And they'll go, oh, yeah, great. Let's do that. And I'm thinking, and presumably there are still American readers who are reading Dreiser. Other things wouldn't be viable. But the same point applies to abstruse. I mean, it's much easier to write about Gissing, say, for the American Spectator than it is for the Guardian, because they're proper Anglophiles over there. They don't muck about. If they like the English writers of bygone days, they'll happily allow you to write 1,500 words about them. Catch that happening here, lit aids.
Yeah, very.
Which is not to blame the literary editors here, because they don't have any space
anymore.
You see, that's the other great desideratum of the critic. Give me space. Doesn't exist.
Yes, I'm always thinking about how much space I had in the Independent on Sundays.
Oh, Suzi, was it 7, 8 pages sometimes?
It went go up to 12.
I remember being allowed to write 1,500-word reviews of sort of biographies of Kingsley Amis and that sort of thing. They were great. Great days they were to be.
Yes.
Be a writer in, be a reviewer in.
The first thing I ever wrote for the Independent on Sunday was 3,000 words.
Yes.
And it was around Frankenstein. There was another film had come out, so I did a whole thing about
those were the days.
Those really were the days. Well, I also want to take you back into, your sort of literary seedbed, as it were.
Yeah.
So I have some questions for you regarding becoming a writer and inspiration and so on. So, I mean, I don't know about you. I don't remember learning to read. I feel as if I could always read, which I obviously couldn't, but I just seem to pick it up immediately. So I get the impression, maybe if you were like that you just...
Yes, I can't remember. I can't remember when I couldn't read. I could certainly read. I went to infant school. Just after my 5th birthday, and of course, that's one of the things, of course, that makes you realise how, however well-intentioned government schemes to encourage equality of opportunity in education, they're always going to fail, because the cards have been shuffled before the children get to school, and so certain children will be able to read when they walk in through the school gates age 5, and some won't, and so they're effectively the ones that can't at disadvantage, from toddlerhood, and everything that happens after that is in some ways really only an amplification of what's already there. So I could read when I went to school. And it was something I always took immense pleasure in. I didn't come from a particularly bookish home, but my parents were extremely conscious of the necessity for this. And of course, you see, being the age I am, I was part of the puffin generation. And my parents sort of watched it as if it's got puffin on the spine, then it's it's good stuff. And by and large, that was true. It was a bit like sort of 15 years later, it was like the Virago Classics when Carmen started publishing the green. If it had a green jacket and it was a reissued classic by a woman writer from the early 20th century, it was bound to be good. You could very rarely went wrong with Virago Classics in those days.
There's also the famous story of Terry Waite when he was a hostage and made friends with his kidnappers and was pleading for something to read. And he said, look for the Penguin. Because there was sort of second-hand English books. I can't remember where he was, but he just said anything with that little penguin colophon. And that
Puffins did for me. Francis Spufford writes very well about this in The Boy the Books Built, his marvelous book about children's reading about 20 years ago.
Wonderful book.
I also liked. As well as Puffins, there was a very good series the Oxford University Press did of children's books. And we used to get those when I was sort of 9 or 10, we used to get those as school prizes. And that those two were sort of fairly formative. There was a wonderful boys historical writer called Ronald Welch that I used to like. He wrote a book called For the King about the English Civil War, which I was completely enraptured by. And at the age of 9, I didn't realise that it was all fictitious, and there wasn't actually someone called the Earl of Aubigny or something like that. I used to look them up in Clarendon's History of the English Civil War and think, he doesn't exist. This is what there wasn't anyone called Neil Carey, and what a shame. And I really liked the sound of Llanstefan Hall where he hung out in 1643. Those were terribly good. I love Ronald Welch's stuff.
Is there a writer who is just so formative in the sense that you thought, I could do this, maybe I could be a writer too, or I want to be a writer?
Well, I think necessarily, I mean, it would be a very odd and extremely precocious writer who didn't start out by imitating somebody else. And funnily enough, I can remember, I'm going to answer this properly, but I'm just going to give you a little sort of taste, a little sort of really very early memory of thinking that, of being so enraptured by a book that I thought it ought to be continued. And this is very early. I mean, this would have been when I was about 7 or 8. And in fact, the two things I'm going to tell you are related for a rather interesting reason. And the book, a book that I absolutely adored when I was about 7 or 8 was called The Family from One End Street.
I've heard of that. Yeah,
the family. I'm trying to remember the name of the author's name escapes me. There was another one called Further Adventures of the Family from One End Street, and it was published in 1937, and it won the Carnegie Prize, and the same year that Tolkien came second with The Hobbit. Tolkien was the runner-up, you see, and I thought it was so good. There were 2 volumes, and I remember at the age of 7 trying to write a third because I thought these are such. It was about this working class family living in the Midlands, 7 children. That's right, Mrs. Ruggles, who was a washerwoman, and her husband Joe was on the dust cart, and it was so. It was obviously it was what was fascinating about it, I suppose, in 1937 was that although obviously it was aimed at a middle class audience because all children's books were in those days, but the subject matter was not middle class, and it wasn't treated condescendingly, and you were very thorough, you were very aware that there were class distinctions here and that they mattered. Mrs. Ruggles' relationship with her Eve Garnett, that was the author's name, Eve Garnett, Family from One End Street, an absolutely, an absolute Parnassian classic, one of the greatest children's books ever written, I would argue. And I can remember, as I say, age 7, trying to write a sequel. But having said that, the connection, of course, is that my next huge crush for some years was Tolkien. And certainly by the age of 12 or 13, I wrote a 50,000 word Tolkien-esque, fantasy romance. It was called Men of Harmer, because Harmer is the name of the gate captain at Helm's Deep in Lord of the Rings. And I was in my the blithe optimism of the 13-year-old, I actually sent it to Allen and Unwin, Tolkien's publishers, and got a very polite letter back saying that it was extremely well written, but I must understand that Professor Tolkien was very well established in his field, which was kind, rather than just bog off with your terrible Tolkien. And I was so sort of obsessed with the Tolkien thing, as were loads of, early teens at that time in the mid-1970s. I wrote another one when I was about 14 or 15, and the virus took several years to work itself out. So those are the 2 writers, I suppose, when I was smaller that I consciously try to imitate, that I thought were worthy models. But of course, the thing about Tolkien is he's completely inimitable, and anyone who's ever tried to write like him has just fallen flat on their backside. So, but yeah, that was the start, I suppose.
I guess fan fiction isn't a new thing then.
No.
There must have been kids.
That's exactly what it was, fan fiction. Yeah. Yes. And in fact, and the tradition, I mean, I can remember Felix, our eldest son, when he was about 10 or 11, was so obsessed with the Lord of the Rings that he started writing, even though the ring had dissolved, and been thrown into Mount Doom. Felix wrote a sequel in which he didn't dissolve, and an orc picked it up, and all kinds of, and he wrote several chapters, very imaginative chapters too, about, what would then happen to the ring in the 4th volume of the Lord of the Rings.
So what about school? I mean, I read The Hobbit at school. I remember we were given it to read. I suppose I must have been about 11 or 12. And there's this moment, I think, where you read fantastic stuff at home that you suspect the teachers would be a bit sniffy about. Like I was reading sort of girls' boarding school stories by Enid Blyton and that kind of thing. And then you're reading stuff at school that you're not that interested in. And The Hobbit was the first book where I thought, actually, these 2 strands come together. I can actually, having gone on as you did to actually study English literature, that was a sort of great moment.
I have to qualify these remarks because I didn't study English literature at college. You see, I'm an historian. And this is a rather curious thing because from the age of about 12, and I can distinctly remember this, I was brought up on historical fiction and also boys' school stories, which from the 1930s, which my father had shelves full.
Jennings and Derbyshire.
No, this is
No?
that's 50s. That's the 1950s.
Oh, is it?
These had titles like Play Up Kings and, there was a particular book called Strickland of the Sixths that I must have read a dozen times when I was about 10 or 11, all about this public school in North Yorkshire with this dynamic captain of the football team called Strickland, and they played in the local cup. They played a team of apprentice boys from the local town, and there was almost a riot, and Strick solved it by simply knocking out the assailant who'd come on the pitch to attack the referee. Football violence in the 1930s. So I was really the books I like reading were historical novels, and from about the age of 12, I actually, again, however precocious and sort of swatty this may sound, I wanted to be a professional historian. That was what I wanted to do. All through my teenage years, I thought I can think of no more enviable destiny than sitting in a lovely panelled room in an Oxford College quadrangle and lecturing on, teaching medieval history or something to, teenagers. And that lasted for many, many years. And so although I was dead keen on Ing Lit and also wanted to write and was trying to write and was writing, novels that never got sent out or published and short stories. I was doing all that from about the age of 14 or 15. But I always thought that the goal in sight at the end of the conveyor belt was teaching history somewhere. And again, that virus took several years to work its way out. So although I was reading lots of novels, they weren't being read with any kind of conscious thought that, I did English literature for A-level, but it was always the subsidiary thing. And I can remember one of the English masters sort of saying to me, you have a certain amount of promise at this, perhaps. And I said, no, I'm afraid I'm doing history. I've already been, and I think in some ways, I don't know. It's foolish to sort of go back and live a subjunctive life and reflect on choices that may or may not have been a good thing. But yeah, until I was halfway through my college history course, I thought, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. And then I decided, actually, this has all been a big mistake. Having said which, I think that the discipline doing history at university was an immensely good thing for me because it teaches you how to deal with large amounts of material, and it teaches you how to gut books. Typically one would be sort of given 12 books to read in a week to produce an elaborate, a succinct sort of summary of all of this. And it was very, very useful to do that. I don't think I would have acquired some of those forensic skills, perhaps, if I'd done English literature.
Was your inspirational teacher then a history teacher rather than an English teacher?
Well, he was rather. I was taught history by this immensely reactionary gentleman called Richard Harris, known as Tweedy, obviously Harris Tweed. And he was, to say that he was a conservative, would be like saying that Donald Trump has strong opinions about it. No, he was a very nice man, a very decent man, and a very encouraging chap too. But he was so, I remember him once, one of the funniest things, he would have been, I suppose, in his mid-50s when he taught me, certainly when I was in the sixth form, and I say he was so right-wing it wasn't true. And I remember him once saying, when a general election came, and he said with one of his colleagues in the common room was called Mr. Wills, the junior history master. I remember him saying, Mr. Wills describes himself as a progressive conservative. And then there was this pause, and he sort of looked, and he went, which is no doubt a very excellent thing to be. You just thought, that's Mr. Wills's goose cooked then. No, he was good. So he was the great formative influence. It was he who said to me, you should do history at Oxford, and this is what you should do, and this is the college you should apply to. But having said that, I much enjoyed. There was a very I very much liked the three people who taught me English in the sixth form. There was a very nice man called Mr. Rowe, Christopher Rowe, his name was, and we liked him because he was enthusiastic, and he was only in his late 20s. He was only sort of 10, 11 years older than us, and so he really, when he was enthusiastic about a book, you caught onto his enthusiasm. And although I found, as I think everybody in those days did, I'm sure you did as well, the actual the coursework, the set books were in most cases incredibly dreary, and you'd think, I don't want, Milton. Oh, come on! Spending a term doing Paradise Lost, even some of the Shakespeare plays. I found that certainly at 16, so I found them pretty dull. At least we were allowed to do Beckett and Hardy, but I would have liked to do modern stuff. I think more than that, and I sympathise too. I mean, Leo, our youngest son, who at 16 was very, very interested in English. He just looked at the syllabus and said, I can't do this. I want to do politics and philosophy. It's much more interesting than all this. And it was still, Paradise Lost and Dryden.
Dryden. Wow. Well, I mean, it's mysterious to me, but we did quite a lot of William Blake, who I love and revere, but I think he was so badly taught that I didn't get anything out of it. So the teacher just completely ignored the experience bit and just did Innocence because she liked Little Lambs, Little Lamb who made thee, and just focused on all that stuff and made him seem very religious. I mean, he obviously is religious, but he's extremely radical in his religious views. So
indeed,
I think you can have really exciting books to read and them just not. I mean, I picked up on him at university, and The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, mind blowing. So yes, I hear what you say about somehow trudging through books for A level,
And I suppose what I really like is the kind of that is the Venn diagram, the space where literature and history intersect, and the one rubs off the other, and you can see how a writer is formed by their particular, the environment in which they're writing, and then you can then see how the history itself is being informed by the writer and that kind of thing. But you see, certainly when I was at, when I was an undergraduate, that sort of thing was absolutely unheard of. There were no joint schools, and if you used a novelist as evidence, for some particular historical theory, people would more or less laugh. So that was all very frustrating.
Right. So quick switch of subject here. What's the most discouraging thing anyone's ever said?
I think this probably relates to what we were just talking about. The idea that there was, in those days, the early 80s, there was the space where history and literature met was A, tiny, and B, contested. And I can remember just after I'd done my university finals, and I kind of had, as I say, I'd done history, but my inclinations were increasingly tending towards literature, or rather, again, that space where the two disciplines meet. And I can remember sitting down with my college tutor, Sir Keith Thomas, as he now is, and try kind of sort of tentatively outlining a few ideas for something I had, which would be about, I suppose, the city and the book, really, and urban themes in literature and the historical background to all of this. And I can remember him quite reasonably for the time, as I say, given the back. I can remember Keith saying, really, what would that qualify you to do? I thought, I've had it. I thought, I'm off here. I'm not staying here anymore. So I left university and went off and got a job eventually in a public relations agency in the West End. That was my first paid employment in 1983.
That's quite a reaction of yours that you had.
Well, no one thinks about this. You see, it would have been perfectly possible, and I know people who did, to have spent one's 20s sort of sitting there writing this thesis. I could never understand why it took people so long to write PhDs. 4 or 5 years. Surely, if you have your subject, you have your impetus, then you just sit down and write it. I mean, it's only 90,000 words or something, and I thought to myself, do I really want to just sit there in Oxford for all those years writing something that probably won't get me a job at the end of it, or go out into the world? So I thought, although going out into the world had its terrors and its uncertainties, in some ways it was preferable to sitting in that panelled room that I'd previously thought such a desirable destiny. So I went and worked for the public relations agency, which was actually great fun, because I had a very simple. I had a colleague there, Marcus Berkman, who I collaborated with. Marcus, who I've known for 40 years now, and I met him there, and we had a fantastic time. I had a very sympathetic director, a marvelous man called Francis Rosati. Francis, we call him, because he he drank port and he smoked cigars and he was great. And he was once, and I used to work in the basement where I was pretty much unsupervised getting on. My first proper job was editing Airfix magazine because our client a toy company. And I loved it. And I knew about Airfix kits. I'd made them when I was a kid. It was jam to me. I was quite happy doing this. But the one thing I really liked was when Francis said to Marcus, and Marcus reported to me, Francis said, the really important thing is that David finishes his novel. Because he knew that I was sitting down there typing away at what became my first novel. I've always been grateful to that, because a lot of people would have been much less indulgent of my, I didn't skive. I did the work that I'm set to do. But if there was time after it, then I got on with what became my first novel. I've always been grateful to Francis for that. I don't know if he's still alive, but if he is, that gratitude endures.
Enlightened employer. Now, my next question, give us one surprising fact about you. We've already gone into your rock and roll burst of stardom in that glorious half hour. Do you have another surprising fact that readers of your work might
a surprising
not
fact?
know about?
Well, you see, we're getting into difficult territory here, Suzi, because a part of me believes in something that one of my favorite writers, Anthony Pohl, once said, is that what one most truly believes about oneself is better kept to oneself. So, in terms of revelations, I'm slightly uncertain about what I should or shouldn't say, or I can't think of any sort of surprise things that I've done that people might be surprised by, because basically I like. All I really like doing is writing, spending time with my family, although the three boys are gone now, and watching Norwich City and listening to music. That's about it, really. With us, and I'm still sort of desperately trying to retain my membership of the Labour Party, but it's getting a bit problematic these days. So that's about it, really. So in terms of revelation, I suppose if I had to say something that I probably feel about myself, which might possibly come as a surprise to people who know me, I'd probably say that deep down I'm fairly insecure. That's about the it's the lower middle. Basically at heart I'm a lower middle class neurotic. You never escape your upbringing in terms of fences climbed and distance traveled, and all the time you're thinking someone's going to pull this rug away, someone's going to all this. I'll get found out. I'll not. So I would say that yes, that is that I would confess, I suppose, to feeling a fundamental sense of insecurity, but it's to do with the class territory that I occupy, or perhaps occupied.
Yes. We didn't have to go that deep. No? I love your answer. I love the revelation. I'm just thinking about things like I can sing the Zambian national anthem.
No, I just thought it might. It might as well be something serious, I suppose. It might as well. About the music thing. If I sort of sit and say, I know everything about English music between 1965 and 1984, and I challenge you to ask me who played bass on the third Screaming Abdabs album, I think people who know my work probably sort of anticipate
would not be surprised.
I think admitting to a fundamental sense of insecurity is probably not that much. It's not a world beater. It's not a game changer, I think.
What family traits have you inherited?
This is a tricky one, because it will sound as if I'm criticizing parents whom I very much loved and appreciated, and whose passing I regret. But I would have to say that I would probably say that I don't know. I would probably say that I'm intolerant, and I know where I got that from, without going into any greater detail. And I'm very quick to judge, and I know where that came from. But it might be argued that ability to form quick judgments is probably something that someone who reviews books for a living needs. I don't know, but I would probably say yes, that I would. And I would hope too that I think I've inherited charity. I would hope that I had.
Any traits that you missed out on that you wish you had inherited?
What, from one or other of my parents?
Yes.
I think we're getting into some serious psychological stuff here. But I suppose I wish I'd inherited my mother's kindness. or her deliberate kindness. You know, I mean, we can be kind without, you know, I don't know. My mother always had the ability to see everybody's point of view and sympathise with them and not judge them and make them feel welcome and so forth. And I fear that I haven't inherited that, and I wish that I had.
Well, she sounds lovely.
She was. No, she was. She absolutely was. Yeah. And, you know, she was one of those quiet, self-effacing people who looked out for other people rather than thinking about herself all the time. And I don't think I inherited those qualities, which is perhaps a shame.
Did you, I mean, did she live long enough to see you as a success and enjoy that?
She died a couple of years ago, my mother, at the age of 90. And it's very curious because my father was this immensely vigorous, purposeful, outgoing person. And I think he would have admitted, highly egotistical. My mother was this quiet, self-effacing. They were complete chalk and cheese, but it all sort of worked in terms of they were married for 47 years and each adored the other. And my father was the kind of person who, if a child tied his shoelaces, you know, that was a cause of wonder and celebration and, you know, run up the flagpole. My father was all, you know, my father lived by success. And if you achieved something, he thought it was fantastic. You know, great. My mother had been brought up in the atmosphere where you didn't show off and you didn't make a fuss about things. And I don't ever remember her really paying me a compliment, but that was fine. It didn't mean that she didn't, you know, it was simply that you didn't encourage people to show off. And so the two, it all balanced out, if you see what I mean. You had one, my father exaggerated the regard he felt for your achievements, and my mother quietly kind of, but I think, I think, you know, I think she did, you know, I think she was very pleased and very kind of, but, you know, she was conscious that, you know, not to make a fuss about things. And there were other people, you know, there were other people who had children, and you didn't go on about your own children because there were other people who also had children and might want to talk about them. So I say it all worked out, you know, and I didn't feel sort of neglected or under-regarded because someone was piling it on with a shovel while someone was adding the occasional delicate pinch.
Did you do things like give them copies of the book and then monitor how far the bookmark went?
No. Well, you see, you could steer into danger if you did that, because I remember somebody pointed out, it's one of those. I really, you'll know as a reader and a reviewer, you sometimes only come across the nub of a work of fiction long years later. I remember years after they'd been written, sitting down and reading all 5 of my first 5 novels, one after another, just to see what they were about. And they all had the same thing. They were all father-sons. They were all father-sons and deracination and people leaving the places where they'd been born and having to go away, and, you know, the pontoon bridge between the here and the now. And in some kind of sense, they were all about my father. And when I gave my father my first novel, which was written in the early 80s, published in early 1986, and it's all about, you know, the character has a sort of a relationship with his father. And my dad, who was then in his mid-60s, told me that he was standing in the queue at the bank in a place called Bullett Square in Norwich. And a man of the same age who he knew, and I knew this man's daughter. We were friends, and he'd obviously seen it. And there's about a dozen people in the bank or the post office, and old Mr. Hyde shouted at my father in the doorway, "He's dead!" My father went, "What are you talking about? In that book your boy wrote, he's dead." And I think Dad sort of ticked him off and said, "You shouldn't think that just because my son writes a novel and it has a father and the father dies, there's anything to do with it." But that was the sort of danger you could run into, you see, with
Do you have an alternative career? I mean, not historian, beyond historian? I mean, do you have a sort of, fighter pilot, bus driver secret?
There's nothing I could possibly have done in the modern world except write. Nothing. I'm completely incompetent. I'm practically and technically inept. I can't drive a car. I can't, I couldn't fix this computer when we had trouble with it before we came on. I'm completely, and in fact, the thing that I'm always reminded of is I used very much to like and follow Paul Weller's music when I was younger. I love the Jam, were my favorite band when I was in my early 20s. Late teens, and I can remember reading an account by one of Weller's friends that when he began, when the Jam had yet to become successful, he used to work on the building site with his father, John Weller. And on one occasion, Steve Brooks, who also played in the band at this point, was with John Weller up on the roof of some house that they were helping to build. And they looked over the gable, and there's Paul loading bricks, feebly, uselessly onto this wheelbarrow. And apparently old Mr. Weller turned to his son's friend and said, Look at him. If he couldn't play the guitar, what fucking use would he be? And I always think that with me, it's the pen. If I couldn't hold a pen, put words on a page, I could be completely unemployable. I couldn't do anything. Almost everything, every other sort of paid activity just bored me. You see, I couldn't have worked in the city. I used to do corporate copywriting in the city before I sort of properly stopped and went fully freelance. It was the most boring job in the world. I mean, watch paint dry than write corporate copy for an accountancy firm, which is what I used to have to do. It's just telling lies in public, and just terrible, terrible thing. And I never cease to thank God that I can get up in the morning and just go to my desk and start writing. It seems to me an absurd piece of good fortune that I'm allowed to do that, and quite a lot of the rest of the world isn't. I never cease to thank God for that benefit.
Well, we've established you're a music lover, a music fan. Do you play music while you're writing?
I don't actually. No, it's. I suppose I used to. I always remember it being said. I was a great fan, and in fact knew and revered Malcolm Bradbury, who's been dead a quarter of a century now. And Malcolm had a big house not that far away from here in Norwich, and he had a study on the upper floor, and he used to sit there listening to loud classical music while he worked away, and that was his modus operandi. I can't do that. Certainly when I was younger and you used an actual typewriter, you wrote stuff in longhand and then you typed it up. I used to sometimes, there were kinds of sort of anodyne progressive rock that I didn't really like, but was suitably sort of sedative to type to. I can remember typing quite a lot of books. I can remember typing quite a few pages to Genesis, Selling England by the Pound, do noodling away in the background. But I can't, the kind of music I like, generally you have to pay attention to. I couldn't listen to it when I was sort of typing something when I was working. So no, I don't. I listen to a lot of music, but I don't listen to it when I'm working.
Now, I feel my writer's block question is possibly not appropriate. How do you beat writer's block?
No, I never. No, don't know what it is. Never been there. No.
So how do you,
which is not that's not being dismissive of people who do suffer from it, because I know it's a real problem, and there are people whose careers are stymied or retarded by this inability, or and I do know people who've kind of had long-term freezes when it comes to writing, or procrastinate to the point that they can put nothing down, or for whom the actual act of writing becomes both a physical and a mental struggle. So I'm very sympathetic to people who do suffer from it, but it's never something I've had a problem with.
So you've had a great day writing, you've finished that short story or nailed a chapter. Do you have a post-writing reward, a snack, a treat of some kind? Or is it just business as usual?
No. It's not like, I'm not like Trollope. I don't just sort of stare at the wall for 5 minutes and then start the next one. No, what I do, I'm a creature of habit. I get the bus into Norwich, which is a couple of miles. We live on the outskirts of Norwich. I get the bus into Norwich. I go into the Book Hive, which we've mentioned previously, the marvellous independent bookshop in Norwich, run by the wonderful Henry Lade. I go in there, I have a chat with whoever's about. I bore them stiff. I eye out what's coming out, and then I have a natter. And when I think I've outstayed my welcome, I wander back down London Street, and I go to Cafe Nero, which overlooks Norwich Market, which is a source of inspiration for me because several of the stories in Poppyland are actually set or in the roundabout Norwich Market.
It's an amazing market, isn't it?
It is.
It's extraordinary.
I have a cup of coffee and a piece of shortbread, and I think beautiful thoughts. And I might write the odd note in the notebook, and then I do a power walk back home just to sort of get some exercise and to obviate the calorific intake that I've just put into myself. But that generally is I would probably do that to celebrate almost anything. Another of actually one of the a quality I suppose I should have mentioned that I didn't, I think, inherit from my parents, which has always served me fairly well, is frugality. So if my agent were to ring up tomorrow morning and say, "Oh, wow, we just got a film deal on such and such and it's worth X," I go, "Ooh, great." And then I get the bus into town, I go and have a cup of coffee in Cafe Nero. So it doesn't matter whether it's finishing a short story or receiving a substantial amount of money for something you haven't actually had to work for. Because I mean, anything like film and translation rights and what Rachel and I call free money. You haven't had to, like PLR, you haven't had to work for it. You've already been paid. And someone's just give you some more, so that's free money. So whatever it was, I would go into. I might, if it was a lot of money, I might go and buy a book.
Right.
I might go and buy a book, or I might buy a CD. But I certainly wouldn't spend more than £12, £13, 15 maybe if it was a book.
Do you ever, you would never do this at the Book Hive, splendid establishment that it is, but have you ever been tempted to sort of go into Waterstones or Foyles and kind of bring your books face out, or perhaps put them on tables are now very, very sort of rigidly organised, aren't they, in bookshops? I don't think you could get away with it now. But
I've not done that for 30 years. Right. It's the sort of stratagem you used to do as a young writer. Go into shops and move the stuff around. Yeah. And I will admit another stratagem when I was a very young writer, when I first started writing journalism for weekly magazines, and this is over 40 years ago. Sometimes I would write a false letter to the newspaper commenting on the piece I'd written, so that the editor would think, DJ Taylor obviously has got the people writing in here, and it's so bogus. But I've known people do worse things than that. But the occasional sort of attempt to sort of tweak the PR gauge in your favour. Yeah.
When I was a lit ed, sometimes
I probably shouldn't have owned up to that one.
No, that's very naughty. When I was a lit ed, sometimes you would start to be suspicious of certain letters.
Yes,
you'd always say, I'm cancelling my subscription, and you'd think, who has a subscription? And they would be outraged by a book review. I am never reading The Independent on Sunday again.
Never again after what you said about Nick Hornby. Yes, okay. Yeah.
And you just think, well, let's not drag Nick into this. I'm sure he's the soul of. I'm not going to give any names.
No.
There were certain things where I just thought, this doesn't really have the ring of truth. And at Time Out, we were generally not short of letters, and I used to edit the letters page, but some of them were a bit, I didn't like that. I thought it was good, and you said it wasn't good. They weren't very exciting. So sometimes we would supplement it with people writing in about themselves, as it were. Like we just put
the worst one I ever got. Actually, I remember I was a great fan of the late Francis King. I thought was a brilliant.
Yes.
And I remember once The Guardian, this is 30 years ago, giving me one of his novels to read that really wasn't one of his greats. Do you know? I mean, I admired him so much, and here was this novel that did really seem to be a more kind of bread and butter pot-born, and I did my very, very best with it, and sort of said that Mr. King has done a dazzlinger, but this isn't pot. And I can always remember that somebody sent to The Guardian, snipped out the review and sent it to me, care of The Guardian, with the words patronising little C word written on it. And I thought, I really did try with that. I really did, and here I am. But that's, again, you accept that. People react to books and to book reviews in different ways. There's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah. Well, there's the other thing where you think you've written quite a good review, and then the next time you see
that's
the
it.
writer, they're kind of like this, and there's one tiny thing that they will have objected to.
Yes. I probably can't better not name the lady novelist with whom that happened to me once.
Yeah.
Tried and did my very, very, very best, and then got completely slagged off in a newspaper. I've just read what he's written about. Oh, it's I'm trying here. One doesn't. Some people imagine. I think that reviewers go in to engagements with books with malice aforethought, but it's not like that. You're always looking for the good stuff, or you wouldn't do it. Nobody ought to spend a career just trying to malign people who write novels. I'm on the lookout for good stuff. It's what Rachel used to say this when she worked in publishing, and sad young people would write pieces, usually in the Guardian, saying, of course, no publisher's interested in talent these days. They don't want to publish anything that's good and new. And Rachel used to say, where is it? Show me the talent. I'll publish it. I want it. Give it to me. It's we're all desperate for talent and good writing. It's just that quite often it doesn't seem to materialize.
Yes. Well, finally, what do you wish you'd known about publishing before you started out?
I suppose I wish I'd known that it wasn't the romantic activity that I conceived of it to be. That I wish I'd known that it was as short-termist and susceptible to commercial pressures and as venal as as every other form of business that I've ultimately been involved with. Because we're all hopelessly naive when we start getting mixed up in this game, unless our parents are publishers, which mine wasn't. My father worked in insurance, my mother was a PE teacher, and if you don't have this kind of background knowledge, you really, certainly at the time when I was beginning to meet publishers, that's 40 years ago, I really did think that it was glasses of sherry and the rattle of the typewriter and people saying to us, here's a fine first novel by DJ Taylor, we must certainly publish this. And to discover that it wasn't like that at all, and bottom lines and sharks and people who were just as sort of duplicitous or evasive or as anybody else, that was a bit disillusioning. But it didn't take very long. The disillusionment didn't take very long to work in, because you saw as soon as you began to be published, which I was in the 1980s, you saw how it worked, and you saw the pressures, and you saw the people who really did live for decent literature, and you also saw how untenable their positions were becoming. And I'm just sitting here, I'm just looking at an obituary that Rachel cut out of the Times of Christopher Sinclair Stevenson, who used to write Hamilton in the 80s and then set up on his own and almost went bankrupt immediately for spending too much money in advances. But he published some brilliant books in his time, Christopher Sinclair. And he made a genuine contribution to the literature of the 70s and 80s. And yet, he was all the book review, all the obituary went on about was the long lunches and the 4 hours at the Garrick and whatever. And you can't now run a business like that, and you probably couldn't then. And the bottom line has to. I mean, it's one of his predecessors, Anthony Blonde, who I sort of knew slightly in his latter days. Anthony Blonde, who ran his own firm in the 1960s, and Blonde used to say that I'll tell you the way to make a small fortune in publishing. Start with a large one. I fear these maxims still apply all these years later.
Yes, I think when I started getting involved in reviewing and just in the book world, from my perspective, you still had the gentleman publisher, just about. And they were big beasts, and they were being hunted.
I mean, I shan't name him, but a publisher of my acquaintance, very occasionally, in fact, someone who has published me in the past, and I would send the book in, and we would go and have lunch at the Athenaeum, and he would say, let's just pretend at being old style publishers for a couple of hours. And we would sort of sit there and have a nice lunch and trade gossip and talk about writers we liked, while realizing that we were like a couple of dodos washed up on the Mauritian Strand.
And yet, here we are. It's not a bad life. I mean,
we're still here. We've survived. We're all these years.
Some days years. I get up and I just think, I just have to read that novel today. I just, got to make inroads into Pickwick Papers today. So
good for you. No,
it's not
I mean, one of my great formative influences was the week after mock A levels when I was 17, and we had a week where we didn't have to do any homework. And I sat down in my father's study and I read Dombey and Son from one end to the other, 900 pages. And I thought, this is the most brilliant thing I've ever read in my life. I've never read anything quite so funny, even though then it was 130 years old. And I thought, this is just devastating, life-changing that was. I can still remember passages by heart of Dombey and Son, and I would bore you with them if we had the time.
That isn't the one with the chap called Carker, is it?
Carker, Mr. Carker's teeth. Yes, his signature teeth. Absolutely. It's also got the ogress and child queller, Mrs. Pipchin, who runs a day school, and of whom Dickens says that she had a hard grey eye that could be taken out and hammered on an anvil without sustaining serious damage. It's genius.
Brilliant.
It's even the minor characters. There's a reactionary Tory MP called Sir Barnet Skettles, of whom it is said that on the occasion where his friends thought that on the occasion where if he did manage to catch the speaker's eye, he would rather touch up the radicals.
I must read it again. I feel a dive into Dickens is calling me, but in the meantime, there's so much contemporary fiction to get through.
You've got Mrs. Leo Hunter to re-encounter. You haven't come across Mrs. Leo Hunter, the great society hostess, and her poem "Can I unmoved see thee dying on a log expiring frog." It's great stuff. It's great stuff.
Yeah. Oh well. Also, it's kind of. I mean, what he does feels so fresh. His techniques of moving huge cast around.
It's got an exuberance. To read the early Dickens is to like listening to one of the early Beatles LPs. It's as if there's something boiling up that the saucepan can barely contain. Effervescence, confidence in style, and what you're doing. It's sort of the urgent. What Levis, writing about Shakespeare, called the fundamental urgency of something needing to be expressed.
I might steal that, David. When I come to write about Pickwick Papers, I might steal that.
You do it.
Well, thank you for joining me in the book bag again.
Thank you.
What a fascinating discussion. And I look forwad avidly to the publication of Poppies later on in the year.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I shall enjoy reading that. So I will bid you adieu and hope to see you in real life very soon.
And you, Susie. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for watching. And we had a few little technical issues at the beginning, but we overcame them and had a wonderful discussion. So do check out David Taylor's massive oeuvre, his wonderful novels, his criticism, his terrific biographies. And in the meantime, join me next time when I do another deep dive, a psychological probing of an author. He's laughing in the background. I can hear you, David. Join me next time, and thank you very much for watching.